We thank you, Heavenly Father, for this day. We thank you for the sunlight. We thank you for the ability to come together and be hopefully well, and ability to concentrate on the task at hand. We pray that as we work through our program today, that we will gain some good insights and to learn how to integrate all that we've studied in bits and pieces, and that the process might become more natural for us and prepare us for a lifetime of learning and studying and preaching and teaching. And we give you thanks in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, we introduced Acts last week as a genre. Last night as a genre. Okay. And I want to look at the specific principle on page 99. Okay. There's a few other comments about that. And we'll move on from there then to the epistles and then to Revelation as genre issues. In all of these studies, genre issues, we need to do universal principles, which is to study to get the data, and so that we can clearly understand what is being communicated and how it's being communicated. There's some interesting things in Acts in and of itself, as we'll indicate here in a minute with an article that his name Kistemaker wrote about some aspects of Acts. Now you'll notice there's a connection with Luke, Acts, and Luke. In other words, Acts becomes the second of the two books written by Luke, is indicated in the very beginning of Acts. And he says, on one hand, the first book, message, that I made concerning all things, O Theophilus, which Jesus began to do and to teach from the day, having given commandment to his disciples, through the Holy Spirit, whom he chose, he was taken up. So this is a continuation, if you will, of the Luke book. So in some sense, and almost everybody notes that we should take a clue from the prologue to Luke to help with our understanding of how to deal with the book of Acts and what he's doing there, which Luke prologue begins in this period here. Since indeed many have taken in hand to describe, to give forth a description or a narrative concerning the things which were fully persuaded among us, as those who were eyewitnesses and servants of the word and delivered over to us, it seemed also good for me, having carefully followed after, from the beginning, all things to write down in order for you accurately. O Theophilus, the things that, so that you might know the certainty of those things that you were instructed. Right? So, to begin with, we've got a historical issue here. It's a narrative. Luke, as well as Acts, is the narrative. It relates to the matters that the church were fully persuaded of, right? And that which they were communicating, handing down to various members, if you will, of the church. And so, in one sense, both Luke and Acts represents that which is being taught, handed down, traditions, right? So there's a heavy theological dimension to it. Okay? Because you don't just make sure you hand down, if you will, just simple historical data that doesn't really have any real, teaching, not only proofs, but that is, those issues that are important in the historical data are the issues of religion and theology, and those kinds of truths. Right? So Acts becomes a continuation of the traditions, and we expect, just as we do through Luke, see that there's a focus, there's a theological focus, so that in the book of Acts we have theological focus as well. Okay, so it's need to be understood in that particular light. Okay, so, as we say here, contextualize the speeches. We'll get to the speeches in a minute, but with a focus on proclamation, well, the whole book is, in a sense, a proclamation of the expansion of the gospel. So there's a theological dimension to it. Okay? We'll come back to that section on speeches in a minute here. Then integrate the epistles into the historical span of Acts. And that's because, as I mentioned last night, look, it's just not a statement of the book of Acts, a statement of the expansion of Christianity, but it's also a statement of development of Christian thinking and Christian doctrine, right? And so what we have in the context of the book of Acts are these epistles, at least, with the approximate dates that kind of relate to this, and so they kind of integrate in here would be, well, of course, approximately 30 AD, Pentecost. Okay. James, I take James was one of the first books written, if not the first epistle written. I take that about 45 AD. Then to take the southern period, and Galatians comes up next, approximately 48, 49. Okay. So now Galatians and Romans have a kind of a very similar theme, and so some have, because of the similarities of the themes involved, some have more impressed with the northern theory and place it then next to Romans as far as the time frame is concerned. I take it the southern theory. Then comes 1st and 2nd Thessalonians during this time frame. Of course, Acts 17 is where he visits Thessalonica, right? 1st and 2nd Corinthians, he goes from there down to Corinth for a year and a half, preach down there and teach down there. And of course, he wanders around as well. So it's 1st, 2nd. He writes when he is left there. Of course, he writes when he's left, but the church at Corinth is when he's writing. Then Romans, written about the same time, about 55. Then Philemon, Colossians, Ephesians, probably somewhat in that order. Okay, though there's some dispute as to the exact order. And then about 61, Philippians being written, and Paul probably released around 62, first epistle. So then there's only left from Paul's writings, we've only got what left? Well, we've got 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, right? Those 3 books. Then we've got the rest of the epistles of the New Testament written during in the context of the book of Acts. Matthew was probably written around 56, somewhere in that vicinity. Okay. So Matthew would be developed in that time frame. We would also have, of course, Luke is written after, approximately 60. And Acts probably written in 61, approximately. Peter epistles, well, Peter is probably written, 1st Peter they place around 61, 62, somewhere in there, sometimes 63, so it might be after this time frame. It might, that is of Acts, might be towards the end of the time frame of Acts. And 2nd Peter, I take it, that is probably written around 65, or 68, 67, 68, which is about the time of Peter's death, and Paul's death as well, around that time frame. And then we have, of course, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, they're written way later, right? And Jude, So much of the New Testament epistles, as you say, can be kind of integrated into the time frame discussed in Acts. Right? Much of it. So keep in mind then that as the epistles, if you will, are written, it's going on during the same kind of struggles and issues that are going on in the book of Acts. So it's good to keep thinking that through as you go through the interpretation both of Acts and of these epistles. Okay? Now, in integration, what I have in this for is not an Acts-oriented exegetical procedure, one that harmonizes the epistles, the integration of the epistles of Acts. Acts provides historical background, which is critical, oftentimes, to the issues that are being raised in the epistles. So we've got to be careful, though, that we don't read too much into it, because some of the issues that crop up in the epistles, for instance in Galatians, are not described in Acts. And yet they were very real issues that were going on at the same time as the Acts discussion. So for instance, Galatians, when Paul and Peter had their little blowout there, discussion with one another. Well, that doesn't occur in Acts, you see. And yet, time frame when that was going on is during the time frame of Acts. And then, of course, number 5, keep the theological formation issue of Acts in the equation as well. Maybe a little bit too much of, I'm not sure how best to put this, maybe a little bit too much of a separation sometimes between the theology in the Acts and the theology of the epistles. What I mean by that is sometimes people say, and maybe in some sense rightly so, we don't get our primary theology from Acts. It's in a transitional stage. But if you mean by that it's not accurate, well, that's not right. It's not that it's not accurate. It's just that it's in the process of formation, to be true, to be sure. But let's say, for instance, just take the book of Galatians. Well, is that in a process of formation, or is it clear as we're talking about? Well, that occurs. That occurs kind of situation in Acts that's fairly early on. You see what I'm saying? I think most of the time the discussion is you don't develop your theology from Acts is to say, well, we don't develop our speaking in tongues. That's usually where it comes down to. We don't develop our speaking in tongues or lack of speaking in tongues from the book of Acts. We realize that's transitional. It's going to go away or whatever else. Well, that's got to be proved from somewhere else, actually. Okay, that can't be proved from Acts per se. And speaking in tongues issues in Corinthians. Right? So that's got to be integrated with what we read in Acts and how that whole thing is developed. That whole concept is developed. So you can't say we throw out Acts as far as having any impact on the theological issues and just go for the epistles. Well, that's really not accurate, is it? Historically, it's not accurate.
Wouldn't it be really easy for people to make negative inferences using the book of Acts? Well, it didn't happen. Well, it happened once here, but it didn't happen here, so therefore it can't happen anymore. Is that kind of what happens?
Sometimes, yeah. It's just a little kind of a dangerous procedure to eliminate theological discussions that are kind of integrated into Acts from the epistles as if they were completely separated, but they're not. Okay. Whereas Acts describes the development of theology in one sense, well, that correlates with the epistles that are written during the same event, time frame, right? So if you're going to say one is a developing theology, well, then that's true of the epistles is a developing theology. Okay. So are we going to class if we say, well, now, the Acts theology is a little bit more on the immature side, if we were to take that route, well then we have to say, well then some of the epistles which were written during that same time frame are a little bit on the immature side. Who's going to say that? Yeah, there you go. You know, they're not going to say that. So, in other words, I think sometimes there's just too hard of a separation between Acts and the epistles. Okay, on this whole business of the theological discussion. So we need to keep that in mind. I've got, now coming back down to the speeches out of this article, I forget where, just to make a note of the exact journal that it was in. But he makes some interesting statements about the speeches of Acts, which makes the speeches of Acts rather significant for its interpretation. About half the book of Acts consists of speeches. Do you realize that? Speeches, discourses, and letters. And so he says, counting both the short and the long addresses, we number at least 26 speeches that are made either by the apostles and Christian leaders or non-Christians, as Jews and Gentiles. I mean, about half the book is speeches, or some sort of letters. He tries to classify 8 addresses by Peter, a lengthy sermon of Stephen before the Sanhedrin, a short address by James at the Jerusalem Council. And then, of course, there's advice to Paul by James and others. 9 sermons and speeches by Paul. And then, of course, there's some by Gamaliel and some others, lesser ones. 2 letters, one from the Jerusalem Council and one written by Claudius Lysis to Governor Felix. Small, sort of. So, anyway, there's quite a bit of speechifying that is involved in the book of Acts. Okay? And therefore, much of the book of Acts, the theology of the book of Acts is developed through these speeches, if you will. He also writes here on the history here, Luke varies the choice of words with reference to locale. For instance, the first 15 chapters have a Palestine location, if you will. Okay? And so the chapters have an Aramaic coloring. That is, the Greek has an Aramaic coloring to it. Okay? But then in 16 of the rest of the book, it's in a Gentile setting, and so the kind of Greek elevates itself in style. So there's a difference in style between 2 halves of the book, 2 parts of the book, based upon locale. That's kind of interesting and involved there. Then he talks about Stephen's speech, which is one of the longer ones here. It's kind of an interesting speech in and of itself. He makes a couple of comments here. One, Stephen, he notes that Stephen is an expert theologian, thoroughly committed or familiar with Scriptures, Old Testament Scriptures. We can see that real easily through there as you read through that. And his theological acumen is much like that of the writer to the Hebrews, which is kind of interesting. And you read the Hebrews, there's much quotations from the Old Testament, much of the historical dialogue that goes on in Hebrews. And that's kind of related to how Stephen has dealt with this issue as well. In his speech, he says, and he's not the only one, Bruce also makes the same comment, Stephen shows that God is not bound to an earthly temple built by human hands. Okay? The issue involved being that the Jews were having a little bit of a problem that the Christians, if you will, are not given as much status, if you will, to the temple. And when you take the gospel to other places, then in fact there's no temple there, right? And therefore there's a little bit of a problem that he wants to demonstrate, according to these writers anyway, that part of Stephen's discussion is that, God appeared to Abraham, there was no temple there. God appeared to Moses. It wasn't the temple there. In completely different locales, right? Therefore, the issue is not location. God can meet with people anywhere, any place. He also makes an interesting statement here that the words promise and affliction in the context of Acts 7 don't correspond to the uses of those same words in the rest of Acts, which says something about, and that's where he's going with this in part, is the fact that this is not Luke's. Luke did not create this speech to put it in the mouth of Stephen, because if he did, he wouldn't use words that are not consistent with his normal usage of words. You see what I'm saying? And he does that not only with Stephen's speech, but he does that with Peter and Paul's speeches as well. But he makes a statement then that the speech, the way he puts it in Acts, is to prepare the Christian community or the reader to this concept of persecution that occurred after.
Would that be anxieties where it would be promised affliction?
No, not in grammatical sense. Okay. When he comes down to speeches about Peter, he says the pattern and the basic theology are older than Luke. And so it's not Luke's, as he's writing about 61 AD theology that comes through in the speeches of Peter. Therefore, he's going to press again. And he compares Peter with Peter's writings. That is, Peter's speeches with Peter's writings. And shows a close correlation there, right? Of course, First Peter is probably written somewhere around 61, 62. He deals with the speeches of Paul, and these speeches of Paul has much theology, of course, tied to it, but not all the speeches are the same. That is, they change. His emphasis changes with the congregation, if you will, that he's preaching to, but the same kind of theological emphasis, evangelical emphasis and proclamations comes through in all of them, even though the way in which he describes it is different. Okay? He mentions, for instance, someplace in here that when he is speaking early on to the Jews, he doesn't use the name Jesus. That is the term Jesus, because that would infuriate the Jews. But later on, he does use the term Jesus in a different context with a different group, especially on to the Gentiles, etc. So that was kind of his historicity of Paul's speech before King Agrippa. He mentions, for instance, in summary, no speech either of Paul or any other speaker in Acts is as personal in tone as Paul's address before Agrippa. So there's very much of Paul that comes through in that speech that wouldn't be there if he just, as a historian, is just kind of creating speeches and putting it in the mouth of somebody there. Paul fits the choice of the words to that class of his audience, as I mentioned before. He repeats his conversion experience, but it's mentioned 3 times. Okay? He gives the speech 3 times. But in each of the times, there's some differences in each of the times that he gives it based upon the audience and what he's dealing with here. Now, if he created the speech, that is, Luke created the speech, probabilities are it would be essentially the same speech in all 3 occasions, but they're not the same. Well, anyway, this article is dealing with the concept of speeches, not only because of the great amount of speeches that are in there, probably half the book, but also because of the fact that some have suggested, you see, that just like the ancient historians, Thucydides or whoever, they created speeches to put them in the mouth of the personages that they're dealing with. Well, even Thucydides, even though they make mention of here, even his own work, History of the Peloponnesian War, he makes the statement somewhere in here. that this historian, adhered as closely as possible to the general sense of what was said. Now, in other words, there wasn't a verbatim quote of speech quotation, if you will, right? And not complete. That is, a summary on the one hand, and a focus of some aspects of it, and in his own words, right? However, and that's true, but in Luke, what we do find is that the speeches that are in the mouths of Paul, Peter, some of these others, reflect the usage of words and ideas of Paul and of Peter and of others, not just Luke. Luke's perspective doesn't come through in a consistent way through these speeches. There's changes that take place, which suggests that, in fact, he is summarizing somebody else's speech and giving the flavor of that individual, not his own. Yeah.
So this would be less, I don't know if I'm using the term correctly, but as far as redaction criticism goes, this would be different than how he put together his gospel, right?
No,
in the sense that he is trying to stay accurate to what they're saying. So,
yeah, but he still chooses. See, it's still not a complete thing. He still picks and chooses, if you will, certain aspects to bring it out. So there's an editorial, the focus, and it's a genuine focus of the speaker.
Yeah.
The theological focus of the speaker is there, but some of the other things that might have been said by the speaker, he didn't include. Okay. In fact, after giving a speech by Peter, Luke himself, as the thing says, and there's many other things he said to the people, he just did not include. So, it's interesting. Well, interesting. I've always been somewhat confused about what in the world Stephen was doing here. What his long historical, discussion is all about. It's some kind of interesting things here that occur in Stephen's speech that kind of shows somewhat of the format, or at least the pegs upon which he is hanging his thoughts. And one of those things, at least twice, God says that God appeared to somebody, but specified a particular location, which is, I think, where not only Kistemaker, but also Bruce and some others had indicated that, where am I at here? One of the focus here is that the issue of the temple, as I already mentioned. Because he makes mention, for instance, right at the beginning of his speech, men, brothers, fathers, hear, God of glory appeared to our father Abraham while he was in Mesopotamia, before he lived somewhere else, and before he lived where you live, right, in Palestine. Then later on, that appeared again, the issue of God's appearing again occurred to somebody else, and occurred to Moses. He made specific mention of God appeared to Moses, who was burnt. And again, he wasn't in Palestine, right? He was located somewhere else. He was in the wilderness, as a matter of fact, at that point, And he goes on to say, in one sense, as God appeared to Abraham, right? And the people kind of rebelled. And God appeared to Moses, and the people kind of rebelled. And that comes down to the end of the sermon, to notice the end of what he's talking about in verse 51. Here's his point, apparently, through all this historical thing. Stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears. You're always resisting the Holy Spirit. As your father's done, you have done the same thing, And so this whole historical resume has to do with how God made an appearance, and God worked through certain individuals, and they rebelled constantly, repeatedly. It's very interesting. Also, just in the very end of that, he mentions here, uncircumcised in heart and ears. And then after this sermon is over, here's Luke now, he's writing, and as they were listening to these things, they were pricked, cut to the heart, their heart. Right? And he mentions that. And then they were gnashing, grinding their teeth against him. So, that's kind of a strange thing. That occurs a number of times in the New Testament. It's a cultural kind of a thing. And being full of the Spirit, looked up into heaven. And then he was saying, I see the Lord standing on the right hand of God. And he said, behold, I see the heavens open and the Son of Man on the right hand of God, and crying out with a loud voice. And they stopped up their ears and they rushed against him. Right? So where Stephen's speech ends with, you're uncircumcised in your heart and in your ears, and then his description of what they were doing, they were cut to the heart, right? And then they stop up their ears, which is, again, bring the emphasis again, the Stephen ended up with on that. Then if you just were to glance through this thing, you can see some of the elements that he uses that Stephen used to bring out to kind of organize his thoughts. And one of those organizing principles, as you can see, it's very frequently used, is this concept of 40 years. Okay? He uses that numerous times, 40 years. And he uses that, of course, about Moses in various aspects, but also that's quoted in the Psalms. And he brings up the Psalms. Okay? And even from the prophets, he brings up that 40 years that the prophetic views, where the book of the prophets, where it says, it's not sacrifice, offerings and sacrifices. You lived to me 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel, and you've taken up the tabernacle of Moloch, etc., and worship the stars of heaven, just to show their rebellion. But that 40 years thing seems to be, since it occurred periodically throughout the Old Testament, he kind of used that, kind of organized his thinking processes. So, and Luke accurately records that kind of a process that's going on in his mind there. So it's an interesting speech. Yeah.
I may have missed it. Did we discuss who we believe Luke was writing to? The people group.
Theophilus.
I mean the people group. As far as what type of people he's writing.
Yeah, general Greek populace.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So similar to his letter.
Gospel. Right, yeah. I think we have to say the same thing. Since he's writing to the same person with apparently the same audience, that is, this letter is going to go the same place Luke went to write his book.
So can we assume that he's making some of the same theological points like he was?
Yeah.
That was what you were talking about before.
Right, yeah. Right. Yeah, there's an agenda, theological agenda, but it happens to be the agenda of Peter, Paul, Stephen, So, okay, so anyway, that's enough of Acts. Let's a couple of things. Let's move on to the epistles. We've done a lot of work in Philippians. Just notice a couple of other things on the book, starting at 101, page 101. There's a lot of work, of course. I would point you to a lot of works that deal with epistles, obviously. I would point you to Doty, for instance, in the bibliography letters in Primitive Christianity. That's a helpful book to nail down his business of the format and the nature of letters itself. Of course, we already have Harvey in there. And Longmaker, I point you to this as well. Biblical Exegesis in the Apostolic Period. If you've never read it, you ought to read it. It has to do with the nature of their interpretation, hermeneutics, if you will, of the epistle writers compared to how Jews interpret the Bible. So one of the questions that he raises in the book is can we interpret the Bible the way the apostles interpreted the Bible? And so he deals with the Jewish interpretation, apostolic interpretation, and his conclusion is, for us, is yes and no. Okay. So that's a good book to deal with. Okay, an introduction to the genre. We may have mentioned this before. I'm not sure everyone who dealt with Philippians, but Dyson tried to make a distinction between letters and epistles. Letters being non-literary, the latter written as a literary device, if you will, form and intended for posterity. Doty makes the statement, subsequent scholarship has reached something of a balance between treating Paul's letters as purely occasional contextual writings directed only to specific situations and as attempts to express a Christian understanding of life which have ramifications for theological expression beyond the particular historical situation, which says, in a sense, they're written not just with one, they're written with particular issues in mind, as in Corinthians, for instance, but designed to go beyond that. Okay, and I think it's clear in some letters. I mean, what does he say? Where does he say? Let's see, where is that? Which epistle that is? Colossians. I mean, make sure that the people in Colossians read this, and you read the one that I wrote to the Laodiceans as well. I mean, the Laodiceans. Make sure you read that one as well. So, there's some sense in which he envisions this to be beyond just simply one simple congregation. Okay. Whenever this epistle is read with you, see to it also that it is read to the church in the third church at Laodicea. And that from Laodicea, that you read it. Right? And so there it is. It's going beyond this. Philemon, 2nd and 3rd John appear to be much closer to letters, and they follow the format of letters very, very clearly. But also, even in those particular letters, there is indications that this goes beyond simply the particular individual involved. Okay? Even in those letters, because of the plural you and the churches and stuff that are mentioned in there. Well, I don't think to mention. Well, yeah, 2 churches in the front. John's epistles. Let's see this one. Let's see. Where are we getting the Philemon? To the church in your house. And then he's writing to the church in your house. There goes mentioned after the sister, Archibus, fellow soldier, and church in your house, grace and peace. The content of the letter obviously goes beyond simply one individual and one person and one church. When he expands the concepts, the theological concepts in there that go beyond that. Okay? And when he uses the plural, and you could say, well, the plural just has to do with the 3 people he mentioned at the very beginning. That's probably not true. Okay, that's the broader church community, certainly. Prepare me a lodging. I hope that through your prayers all shall be granted, and I shall have given this gift to you. Well, your prayers, that's plural, so which is, by the way, interesting psychological approach in that whole book. But 2nd and 3rd John is even clearer that it goes beyond simple churches. Now the divisions of the letter are important to try to nail down when you deal with an epistle. We tried to do that, and we did do that in Philippians. There's always usually an opening and a salutation, a thanksgiving or a blessing containing a prayer, then the body, then the parenthesis or instructions and exhortation, conclusion. Most epistles can be broken down, and you can discover, and you can find some of those things, and there are clues as to where the one thing begins, ends, and the other thing begins. We've seen that, for instance, in Philippians, just to point out where it is. In chapter, verses 3 through 11 begins thanksgiving for him, but then he made that statement in verse 12. I want you to know, brothers, that becomes a transitional formula into the body of the letter. Some letters are a little more difficult to figure out where the body is really beginning. Okay? For instance, you take a book of Colossians. It says, we give thanks in Colossians in verse 3. I mean, that's where his thanksgiving is apparently starting, but you would have to go all the way through until you get to chapter and verse 6, before the body per se appears to be done. Okay? He says, therefore, as you receive Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk in Him, and then that's where it seems to be beginning. Okay? Body. So there's a lot precedes that. In the book of 1 Thessalonians, right? It starts in verse 2, the first chapter. That is the Thanksgiving formula. Okay? And you don't, until you get down to about verse, into chapter 2. It's into chapter 2, approximately verse 13 or whatever, before we really start getting into the body proper. Same thing occurs in Ephesians, where there's an extensive prayer section. Okay, then it gets into the body. Galatians is different in the sense it doesn't have any blessing formula, in the sense of only wonderful people, God bless you, keep going on the way that you've been going. He just jumps all over their cage right from the very beginning. Okay. So that's different. So, but these epistles, well, let's see, this seeks to break down various aspects of the letter formula in here. And, for instance, in Galatians, he starts off with reading a rebuke formula. There's a new one right there. Okay. Epistolary structure doesn't come real clear as to what you would call the body of the letter, except for just simply when it starts with a rebuke, and he has it starting right away, practically, is what's happening there. He's got in the structure of the Philippians, of course, is basically the same way we broke it down. Dodi, by the way, also gives a description of all of these, but how the thing works itself out. Structure in Thessalonian epistles, closure formula, so we're down into verse somewhere down in chapter 2 chapter 2 verse 1 according to Wanamaker's structure where it begins. So the first chapter, Second Thessalonians, well, pretty much all of them are broken down, all the Pauline letters that he discusses there. That's important. It's important because of the nature of the Thanksgiving formula, right? As we mentioned before, that becomes kind of a clue to the key issues that are going to be developed through the rest of the book. So that's important. Now, genre-specific principles, we've already done much of this. Universal principles, we'll walk through some more of this today when we integrate things. Outline the book in terms of its epistolary form. That's always a good plan to do. Okay, in your outline. Give attention to the Thanksgiving period, which we've already talked about. Determine the nature of the argumentation, and that's where Longacre can be of real help there. Don't overlook, of course, historical times, and we might want to connect it up with some aspects of Acts when we deal with the epistles. So that's all we need to say about the epistles as a genre. Okay? Unless you have questions. Okay.
Does that book you mentioned, or maybe I just saw it there, give some good insight into other letters that are not biblical letters?
Dodi?
Yeah,
I think it begins. It deals with Greco and Roman letters, letters and primitive Christianity, but then he bases that upon letters in the world general.
Okay.
And then moves from there to show how that in fact these letters have real close correlation with.
Was that a long this kind of letter writing, extensive, long letters, was that something long being done, or did Paul and these guys, the apostles, kind of take it to a new level because of what they were writing, or have you ever?
I really couldn't answer that.
It'd be interesting to know.
It's an important issue because, the nature of the letter. Some people just take them as occasional letters, let's say, relating to specific historical situations in a cultural milieu of the time and place, and therefore using that paradigm, that is, it's only this place, only this time, only this cultural situation, then they can eliminate implications beyond. Right? So we've got issues that relate to, of course, the feminist movement, and all of that stuff. Well, that was written during a time and in a culture when women were put down, but we've way advanced way beyond that now, and therefore these issues, restrictions and stuff, don't apply anymore, right? And we do the same thing in some ways, I suppose, potentially. Some things that we don't want to apply, we can pretty much eliminate by putting it back into the cultural context, right? Women wearing hats and covering their head, we don't use that anymore, right? Well, most of our churches, I suppose, are churches, right?
We got a few around here.
Huh?
We got a few around here.
Yeah, we pretty much relegate that to a cultural thing, I think, pretty much, right? And yet there's a statement that Paul makes in that passage that says, because of the angels. Now there's an interesting thing that seems to go beyond just pure and simple culture. How do you deal with that? Interesting problem there that deals with that.
Long hair.
Long hair? Yeah. Well, it's a shame we're long hair. For men. The same token, it's a shame for women to shave their heads. In the Corinthian passage, it's the cultural, but there's some things in there that do kind of tie some of that stuff into cultural things. Examine, is it a shameful thing, he says to the Corinthians, is it a shameful thing for a woman to shave her head? If so, don't do it, right? It shows them up as a prostitute or whatever else, right? Cultic prostitute. And if it's a shame for men to have long hair, kind of thing. But that seems to be cultural related. But to some other things, questionable. Okay. But if you take all of these letters just simply occasional, whatever, you can pick and choose what you want. Okay. And so it becomes a game in some people's minds, I suppose. Let's talk about the hardest book of the Old New Testament. The Apocalypse. Man. My small group at church we finished Galatians, and they said, what do you want to study? And I said, well, let's study the Revelation. That's okay. I've taught it many times, and I enjoy the book, but from one standpoint, it's got to be one of the most difficult books at all for people, not just because of the imagery and everything, but because of the fact that if you don't know the Old Testament backwards and forwards, practically, you're lost. Because the imagery and the symbolism and everything else is tied to Old Testament, and very often it is it doesn't say, as it says in the book of Isaiah or something. It doesn't do that. It alludes in almost every other verse, practically. It alludes to the Old Testament without connecting up. There's no direct quotations in there. In other words, where there's a statement in there that says, as the Scripture says, and then it quotes. There's no direct quotation, but there's constant allusions to the Old Testament. Right? So that makes it very difficult. People who are in high school group, for instance, who know the Bible that well, my goodness, it's interesting. Okay, so looking at the Apocalypse, and just at the bibliography, one of the first things you need to do in dealing with that is deal with this whole view of the book as a whole. How are you going to view it? So you might read a book like Page here, 4 views on the book of Revelation. Okay? Is it futuristic? Is there a futuristic element? Is it preterist? Does it interpret that? Or is it just simply the ethical concept of battle, a symbolic description of the battle between good and evil, good finally wins out in the end, kind of a thing. How do you deal with that? Right at the beginning, I have to talk about that with my small group. Let's talk about this first, because there's people in all categories, right? And even breakdowns of the major categories as people who are living in that world. And so that needs to be dealt with, and that's the issue right at the very beginning you have to deal with. You've got to deal with the difference between apocalyptic and prophecy, and the fact that Revelation has characteristics of both. So people don't understand what apocalyptic is. Did I break that down here? Yeah, I do. But also, the Revelation is apocalypse, but it's also prophecy. I mean, both. Okay, and there's distinct differences between the two. Okay, and so we have to deal with that at the beginning stages. Okay, so that that's a hermeneutical issue. Okay, and there's a whole matter of perspective that's involved. The apocalyptic writer, for instance, doesn't view the present existing world situation as savable, if you will. It just kind of writes it off and says we're waiting for God to come and break into this sphere and, bring His judgment and get things rolling on a positive realm. Whereas the prophetic literature really does try to encourage people to change so that the whole environment can change, right? So there's a completely different perspective that occurs here, and you don't want to take the apocalyptic and try to apply principles that we apply to prophetic, etc. Okay?
Right, verse 3 says that, says, "And they that hear the word of this prophecy and keep the things that are written therein."
Right,
So
that's
it
right.
encourages that.
Yet it's called an apocalypsis or an apocalyptic, and there's a sense in which there is a time, at least, when there's a writing off, if you will, of the existing situation, just waiting for God to come and take care of things. Okay. So, notice the characteristics.
Is that the only book that you wanted to talk about?
Well, some of the others, like these interpretations of interpreting the book of Revelation, it's a small book there, but it gives a little bit of help. And I think Redanis gives a little bit of help as well. Those are the only main ones I want to mention right offhand that you have to deal initially with. Okay. The concept of apocalyptic, I just want to point out the distinctions coming out of cracking Old Testament codes here. Okay. Notice, prophecy urges repentance. Apocalyptic considers the world situation beyond hope. Prophecy focuses on God's displeasure of human sinfulness. Apocalyptic assumes that the hearers or readers want God's solution to come. Okay. Prophecy summons God's people to obedience. Apocalyptic urges the faithful to persevere. Right? You find that in the letters of the churches. Prophecy announces judgment and offers salvation through natural means or human agents. Apocalyptic announces personal judgment, which is supernatural means. Focuses differently. Prophecy says, "Thus saith the Lord." Apocalyptic communicates in images, visions, and symbols. Prophecy predicts short and long-term judgments and salvation. Apocalyptic focuses on the final solution. Okay. And there's other, by the way, distinctions in other works as well that people will know. But there's a distinction. But Revelation has both characteristics involved. Yeah.
So this creates, if you take it from just one point or the other, you're going to have a completely different understanding.
You could.
Mm-hmm. Is that why we see two main camps?
Well, two main camps?
Or 14?
Those who would take the view that this is just a issue of battle between right and wrong, and right will ultimately win, I think they would take these distinctions between prophecy and apocalyptic and just kind of not emphasize either one of those, really. You know, it just kind of doesn't get very much press, okay? Because you wouldn't need to. I mean, the symbols are just there to show us there's bad and bad things happen, you know, and there's good and good things happen. You know, it's all symbolic. Those who take it as history, predator viewpoint, then take the symbols. Since obviously God didn't break into the world and destroy everything and, you know, all bad and keep the good, you know, as apocalyptic would suggest, right? Obviously, if you take the predator's viewpoint, that is, it's all history from this standpoint. It all occurred during the first few centuries there, first century of the church, right? First and second centuries. Then, obviously, the apocalyptic issue kind of disappears, you see. And actually, some of the prophetic disappears as well. Okay? So it depends upon that overall viewpoint in some ways. Okay? So it's a tough book to begin with. Notice the specific principles of exegesis. Apply all universal principles. Now you have to do an awful lot of work in it would be an awful lot of work in hermeneutics, if you will, dealing with symbols and whatnot, and also an awful lot of work dealing with quotations and allusions to the Old Testament. Awful lot of work. And that kind of correlates itself. In other words, the allusions are very often, the symbols are very often tied to Old Testament allusions, and so the interpretation very often would come from understanding what the Old Testament idea is involved and then bringing that forward, you see. There's an awful lot of that. There's what seems to be awkward syntax in this particular book, and diagramming and whatnot can become a nightmare because, in fact, if the whole thing is written, sometimes it appears that it reflects visions and reflects some fantastic things and imagery that's coming along, and he's writing some of this down, and so there's some seeming jerkiness, if you will, and and some ellipses that is leaving unnecessary things out, and so there's a lot of that kind of grammatical stuff that appears. To some, they have said, well, this is bad Greek, and others would say, no, this is not bad Greek. This is just the emotional and the personal context of the individual writer at the stage. His mental state creates what seems to some people to be bad Greek. It's not bad Greek, in my view at any rate, but it is certainly stressed Greek. Okay. So you can outline the book, and that in itself is an interesting procedure. The number 7 occurs so many times in the book. I mean, there's a principle of 7 that you have to take into account throughout this whole book. I mean, right from the very beginning. But I mean, there are 7 churches. Okay, there are 7 bowls. There are 7 seals. There are 7 trumpets. 7 occurs numerous times. There's 7. See in chapter 17. There are 7 kings, rulers or beasts, if you will. And then an 8th comes up and he does something else. And 7 is an organizational principle that occurs over and over again. Okay, and you have to evaluate the whole book in a sense in light of this apparently organizational principle. Okay, of 7. Okay, which is in itself interesting. We'll get to, let me just, illustrate, for instance, something, let me go through this and I'll come back. You got to set an overall interpretive stance, which we've already mentioned that. plan for continuous historical studies. That's certainly true. In the quotations and allusions, you'll be spending how much time in there? A lot of time in there. Study literary aspects. There's issues of overstatement, understatement. That is what should take place. Try to make, for instance, this may take the overstatement here in business. Chapter 9, we got these strange creatures that occur, come out of this abyss, and they've got wings and everything else, and tails that look like scorpions and whatnot. And the Hal Lindsey approach, well, these are Cobra helicopters, Okay, well, that's making a little, certainly a wild leap into the known from what is really an unknown thing. And besides, what we know of genetics today, we could say, look, there's no reason why this couldn't very well happen in the way in which it's stated, Okay, so, but at any rate, so there's a possibility of going too far, not far enough. It's always possible in this particular book. Okay. And say maintain a synoptic view. What we need to do is to keep the big picture in mind and not get so hung up on the details that we kind of lose sight of the point of the whole book. Matter of fact, my initial perspective in this book is verse number 1 says this is a revelation, apocalypse of Jesus Christ. One thing you could say, you could interpret that to mean, well, a revelation that Jesus Christ gave. Well, that's true. It's also a revelation of the person of Jesus Christ. As a matter of fact, then towards the end of the book, chapter 19 and verse 10, I think a significant statement. And I fell down before his feet to worship him, and he says, don't do it, I'm your fellow servant and of your brothers, who hold testimony of Jesus. And then this final statement, worship God. And then this final statement that says, for the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. The issue is, what does that term spirit of prophecy mean? Okay. And when you do the exegetical work, previous reference and all this, you can discover this is the issue, it's the life principle. That's the meaning of the term here. The life principle in this prophecy is what? A testimony, a witness to the person of Jesus. That's it. And when you lose that perspective, in other words, if you get so concerned about trying to identify, who this beast is, and try to put a name to it, Mussolini, Hitler, Clinton, whatever, then I'm not saying you're wasting all kinds of time, but I'm saying you're not focusing on the primary issues of the book. It's to tell us about Jesus and what he's like. And it's more about God, if you will. And that's what brings it to life. Okay? And too much of the book of Revelation, that is writing on the book of Revelation, is just trying to nail down every, by month, the things that are going to happen through the tribulation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you see. Well, that's not the purpose of the book. Okay? Not to say there's nothing there you can nail down. Sure, there are some things you can nail down, right? But the purpose of the book is not to nail all that down and have us just focused on a timeline. Okay? It's a bigger purpose than that. One of the in the chapters 4 to 19, there in the tribulation chapters, there's this constant or this sequencing. Start with the seals, 7, right? And you start with and then you come up with the trumpets, and then you have the bowls, right? Later on, chapter 16, and the bowls. Well, just dealing with how people interpret those, the sequence of those becomes a key issue in the interpretation of this book. There are those who say they are sequential. One group happens after the other group. There's another, like Wahlberg, for instance, who say, no, it's kind of like a telescopic thing, and you've got 6 seals, and the 7th one encompasses all of the trumpets, and then the 7th trumpet encompasses all the bowls, so they're not sequential in it exactly, Then you've got his name who wrote the Church and the Tribulation, Gundry. Yeah, that name. There's more than one of those. But he has a view that I think is probably more accurate. But he's a post-trib guy. That's the whole point of his book. But anyway, he deals with these sequencing in a way that's more consistent with the Hebrew mind and mentality. And that is the seals go from the beginning of the tribulation, so to speak, to all the way to the end. Okay. And the trumpets, they have 7 trumpets. They begin somewhere in the sequence of the tribulation, but they go all the way to the end. Okay. And then the bowls do the same thing. They start somewhere in the middle, if you will, and then they go all the way to the end, so that you've got a sense of which in the Hebrew mindset, you give a general overview, you go back and you focus in on something else, right? So I think he's got a better view on that whole thing. But it makes a big difference as how you interpret them, the whole, just how you sequence these things, okay? So it's really a tough book to deal with it.
What kind of things can we glean from the perspective of the first audience and what they would understand?
I think that has to be viewed probably in an apocalyptic vein. That is, why is John writing and what is intended to do? Well, it's intended to bring, of course, understanding, but encouragement in a context of persecution and real difficult times for the Christian church. Okay? I mean, it's intended to do that. That's what apocalyptic does. It says, just hang in there. God's going to solve it all in the end. We're going to win, and God's going to do it, right? And that's what the book is doing. So it's an encouragement, if you will, in that sense. Written to, probably the people of Asia Minor initially, probably those 7 churches in the whole area. Okay. I don't know if that's what you're asking or not.
Somewhat, yeah. I'm just trying to think if I was sitting in the pews and I was hearing this for the first time, what perspective how would I understand the sequence of events?
Yeah. Well, like I say, there's a lot of work, like mine have to do right now. There's a lot of work that has to be done before you get into some aspects of this, right? I mean, just to the issue of we dealt with chapter 1 in our Bible study. Okay, that wasn't too hard, chapter 1. I mean, it was a lot of things there that relate back to the Old Testament, a lot of the imagery of the Son of God, and all of his clothing and his appearance and all of this really directed from the Old Testament, and all of that. But then when you got into chapter 2, okay, now the message of the churches. Now there's very good views on what we're dealing with here. You take the view this is a history of the Christian church from the first century all the way up to today, so we're in the Laodicean church, or you take, what view do you take of this? Or are they just simply related to specific churches of John's day in Asia Minor, and they're disconnected from, us, in a sense? How do you deal with this? I mean, there's good people that have all kinds of views of this, right? So, I just finished we did in our Bible study, I just finished chapter 4, I got to get into chapter 5, but then before we get to chapter 6, now that's when the first seal gets broken. So now all I got to do, I got to stop now, and I got to deal with this whole business of these sequencing of these things, you see. So it's got to be, in other words, you got to lay a groundwork before you move forward, otherwise you're completely lost. Okay? So, the interesting thing about the book of Revelation is that, it requires an understanding of the Old Testament to understand Revelation. Okay? So, the Old Testament is indispensable to Revelation. But also the other way it works too, because Revelation is indispensable to the Old Testament, because if you didn't have Revelation, many of these things would never come to a final conclusion. See what I'm saying? And so it's a difficult book. My final conclusion on this, don't be afraid to teach it, exegete it, teach it, and preach it. You know, I have some, I won't mention any names, but actually it was 2, maybe 3 now, but I know for sure 2 former pastors of mine who have said, look, I never teach or preach prophecy. Why? Because all it does is generate argument, and it doesn't, and fights and discontent, and it doesn't deal with real issues of life, so to speak. Well, I mean, 50% of the Bible is prophecy, so...
As if you're going to stop fighting and arguing with not preaching definitions.
Yeah, right.
And you miss out on the blessing.
Is it better to fight over the interpretation of Revelation or the color of the carpet? What is better to fight over? At any rate, but I think that's probably wrong. I mean, in my final conclusion here, Paul says, wherefore I testify to you today that I am pure, clean from the blood of all, for I have not withheld, that is, withdrawn, neglected to declare to you all the counsel of God. Well, guess what? Prophecy and revelation is part of the counsel of God, and people need to know about it. The problem is they're looking at it as if it was some sort of a Ouija ball for the future, or some sort of crystal ball for the future, and they're missing out on the main point of it at all. And I told them, look, apocalyptic, these various things that we need to know, apocalyptic, that we need to understand. The nature of apocalyptic is to describe that is to explain it, as we have in Daniel. We got some strange beast, and then the messenger comes along and explains what that is. That's the king of Greece or whatever, right? I mean, that's it. And those things that are not necessary for us to understand, but they're placed in there maybe for more impression than anything else, they're not explained. We shouldn't be spending most of our time trying to understand what can't be understood on the basis of how it's written, you see. They're there for impression purposes. And we need to focus upon what can be understood. Are we pretty much out of time? Is that what we're saying?
20 minutes.
Well, Well, anyway, that's the revelation I was going to illustrate for you. I did I've done a lot of study in it, but one of the things that I had written one time, and it's just to show, this is just to show the difficulty that's involved in exegeting the book of Revelation. You have, for instance, a statement in chapter 20 of the book of Revelation. I'm using a different Bible than my normal one. And whenever these 1,000 years are completed, verse 7, okay, and Satan will be loosed from his prison. He shall go out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, be Gog and Magog. Okay. There's only one other place in the whole of the Bible that describes the Gog and Magog battle, if you will. And that's in Ezekiel 38 and 39. Okay. Now there are at least six different interpretations of when the battle of Gog and Magog occurs. And here's the different times. I'll just listen to you. One interpretation is battle has already taken place during the days of the High Epiphany, so it already occurred. Well, and the question then would arise, what in the world is he talking about then? How do you interpret Revelation 20? Okay. Or it will occur before the tribulation period. Okay, so somehow between prior to presumably the rapture and the tribulation that occurred, right? That still raises the question of this reference here. Ezekiel's prophecy will take place, which is what Ezekiel, that's where it is. Ezekiel will take place in the middle of the tribulation, which many dispensationalists hold to. That's when swooping down and create the change in the 3.5 years break in the middle of the tribulation period. But That's kind of strange then, because the only other mention in the whole Bible of it is after the millennium. Right? So that's kind of hard to deal with. How do you deal with that? Okay. The end of the tribulation period. There's another option there, right? Well, but this still related to the battle of our final, after the battle of Armageddon. Okay? But this here talks about after the millennium, right? And then the battle will occur after the millennium, since the only place that it other mentions it is here in Revelation 20. Now you got to go back to Ezekiel and say, well, okay, Ezekiel 38 and 39 fit after the millennium. It can't. Okay, so what do you do with it? See what I'm saying? It makes it really difficult issue. And one of the suggestions, which would happen to be the seventh suggestion, which was my interpretation of it, and the seven being that perfect number, tongue in cheek there. Has to do with this, and I wrote a paper on this actually. And I did an exegesis of Ezekiel 38 and 39, but also wrote a paper on this Gog and Magog in Revelation passage. And I tried to explain the fact that number one, in my view, it can't occur after the Gog and Magog of Ezekiel 38, 39 didn't occur after the millennium. Okay? But I had to explain why the terminology here. Okay? And where does it occur? And I tie that into chapter 19 after the battle of Gog and Magog there. I mean the battle of Armageddon, if you will. In that, so Ezekiel 38, 39 would occur at that time frame, but they have to explain then, well, how come the terminology, the only other place in the Bible where it occurs is here, right? In Revelation 20 after the millennium. So my paper had to deal with that whole issue there. But it makes it really tough because you have to do a good solid exegesis of Ezekiel 38 and 39 just as background for this dealing with this. Okay? And so many times, and that's just one illustration of the really the difficult nature of exegesis in the book of Revelation.
Are you going to give us a summary of your paper?
Oh, I could, but I don't think we have time.
Sure we do.
We do.
Yeah, we're here all day. Yeah, you do. Yeah. Some other issues that I just might mention. Maybe I'll do that. But for instance, in chapter 17, just another issue. Chapter 17, which talks about this woman sitting on this beast. Well, there are a number of beasts that occur throughout these chapters of Revelation here. Okay, it's trying to explain. So some of this we're supposed to understand, apparently. The angel said to me, verse 7, well, why are you amazed or marveling? I will show you the mystery of the woman and of the beast who bears her and has these 7 heads and the 10 horns. So now notice the sequence. The beast which you saw and is not and is going to come up out of the abyss and is going to go into ruin or destruction. Right? And those who dwell upon the earth will be a marvel, amazed, whose names are not written in the book of life. So what we've got here is a beast, apparently. A woman is sitting on a beast, right? That he exists, or was existing, doesn't presently exist, is going to come and exist later, coming up out of the abyss, right? So there's a beast there. Okay? Then it goes on to explain his name's not right, as who see the beast that he was and is not and yet will be present. He'll come back. Okay, and now here and then his statement, amazing statement, right? Here's the understanding of one of that is wisdom. Yeah, right. 7 heads are 7 cities. Our mountains give you 7 mountains. No, this is where you get the 7 hills of Rome kind of a thing there. That may be questionable, but when they try to apply that, when they apply this wicked woman to the apostate religion being wrong, you see, I question that myself. Upon which the woman is sitting, and there are 7 kings. Now these 7, the 5 fallen, 5 kings. One is, that is, he exists, and another one has not yet come. Okay? And whenever that one comes, you see, okay, it's necessary for him to remain around for a little while. Okay? So now I'm trying to get a historical sequence of kings here, you see. And you wouldn't be surprised, I'm sure, of the suggestions for the historical sequence. They're pretty amazing. Okay. And the beast which was and is not, also he is, now here's another, he is the 8th, and he comes out of the 7th, and he's going to go into the world. He's the 8th. Okay. He's the 8th one. Okay. And then it goes into the 10 horns, which are 10 kings who receive a kingdom, and it goes on and on and on. So I mean, here's a section where there's great detail, which apparently we're supposed to try to grasp some of that, obviously, because the messenger is explaining it, okay? And yet, so it's on the surface, it's just a historical description, and so people then are trying to nail down the history of this. And so they've got the various Roman kings at the time of John, Caesars, trying to figure out all these scenarios. So if you're a preterist, you've got to figure out who in the world is one who was not and now is and is going to come back, and
what appears to be going to.
Yeah, and which one is that? If you're a futurist, then you got to figure out, okay, which are the ones that are history and which are the ones that are yet future, right? Okay, and you've got to also figure out issues of terminology, and I think probably a very significant aspect of this is the terminology for this one particular beast. Where's his name here? Okay. Beast of the beast of the abyss, if you will, coming out of the abyss, because that has references back in chapter 13. There are 2 beasts there. One of them is specifically described as that. But anyway, so there's connections in the book, and there's connections in history, and presumably connections in the Old Testament. We're all trying to bring all this together into an understanding, right? So, are we amazed when practically every other commentary on Revelation has a different perspective of how to interpret all this, right? So it's not an easy task. It's a daunting task. Okay. And one thing I would suggest to you in light of all that, do your best exegetical work that you can, but just try to refrain from being too dogmatic at any given point. Okay? Because there are so many interconnecting issues, themes, passages, historical, non-historical issues, symbolism, all this stuff, interconnected in the book, outside of the book, all over the place, that it's almost impossible for any one person to have an encyclopedic understanding of all of that. Right? So let's be a little more tentative, maybe. That's not to say we can't come to conclusions. I'm absolutely convinced in some of this stuff. But I'm not going to sit around and argue for it. I'll explain why I'm convinced on some of this, but I'm not going to argue for it because there may, in a sense, be some things some data, information that I don't have. Okay? So I'm not going to, as they say, go to the cross for any one of the things unless it's absolutely clear and beyond dispute. Well, let's take a break, and then we got to get started on some of the integration stuff. But maybe